Hi, everyone. This is Cynthia, your voice coach. I'm excited today to have a guest with me. We will be talking about how important it is to work on yourself. And one of the things that we work on ourselves is through going back to the childhood and find out what were the patterns that created who you are. And it is so important for your voice development. And I invited a guest expert with me today, Walker Crone, and he will be sharing with us. And so first, I'll start with introducing who he is. Walker Crone is an accomplished psychotherapist and the director of the Hoffman Center, Australia and Singapore since 1991. And he is also one of the directors for Hoffman Institute International. He was trained personally by the Hoffman process creator, Robert Hoffman, in the late 1980s, and is a senior supervising facilitator of the Hoffman process. Walker's extensive professional background includes family therapy, self-psychology, and creative arts therapy, as well as international organizational development. He also speaks and writes widely on emotional healing, re-education, and spiritual renewal through the exploration of early childhood conditioning. Welcome, Walker.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Sure. And so I have personally attended the Hoffman process, but I know that a lot of people do not know about the Hoffman process. So can you help us understand what the Hoffman process is or is not?
All right, I'll try my best because it's basically a 6.5 day intensive program embedded in a 3 months follow-up, and that varies from institute to institute a little bit. But it's a piece of work that helps us to make a differentiation between who we are, our essence, or we call it in the process also our spiritual self, or call it or the position of mindfulness. This is one of those terms that we nowadays people like to use, or pure consciousness. So it's non-denominational, and also has a view of what our behavior pattern, what our personality is, because how it works for people. A lot of people these days, they get very easily triggered, particularly also with the pandemic, with all the climate change and all the difficulties that we're actually facing globally. I notice that more and more people are more stressed. There's much higher level of anxiety in people, and to be able to manage that is I think it's important for people to come back to a place within themselves where they can be at peace with themselves as well as at peace with the world around us, which is sometimes not difficult when the world around us is full of chaos, full of ambiguity, and full of unknown factors. So it's so much more important these days to find a resting place within ourselves. And so what the process really does, and I haven't come across a better program so far, that really helps us to understand what the trigger points are that gets us going, and to also not only understand it, but also to emotionally work it through. And so it's very much, we get a lot of people also, we have a lot of clients from Singapore and Hong Kong, Asia, lots of people, entrepreneurs, leaders, people in leadership positions have come and done this program because they realize they need to have more of what we call soft skills. So how to manage family, how to manage themselves requires actually, it requires a knowledgeability about our emotional triggers. So basically emotional literacy, but then also to develop an ability to zoom out of when we get triggered, to actually have tools and practices at hand, so we are able to come back to a place of equilibrium within ourselves, so a place of inner peace. And so really that's on one level what the process really is about, helping people to really spread more into their potential and spread more into their creativity from a place of really understanding what their own intrinsic values are, and to understand who they are and who they are not really. And so, and to find really this support within themselves to lead a life where they're more in authenticity with them.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And it is that nowadays, especially with the pandemic, with the economic crisis, so people are getting more and more anxious. So I think you have made it quite beautifully about this process, that it is about finding this peace inside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they might be having a question of, okay, so isn't that other ways that we can find this peace or work on our emotional literacy? So what is so special about this Hoffman process?
Well, there's a couple of ways how I can actually talk about it. So one way, and it's probably good to introduce some of our basic principles. So there's one principle which we call the quadrantity model, which is a conceptual framework to help us understand our own behaviors. So where we look at, first of all, the physical self, which is our body. Then I mentioned already our essence of spiritual self, or position of mindfulness, pure consciousness. And then we also have two other aspects that we look at. One is the emotional child, which represents our feelings. And then the counterpart of that is our intellect, which is basically our thought patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the context of the process, we perceive the emotional child and the intellect. They are part of what we call the conditioned personality. Mm-hmm. So the emotional child, and while we refer to the emotions as being a child, because we start to see that sometimes, well, obviously physically we grow older, intellectually we might make more distinctions. However, emotionally, sometimes we act as if we are still a child. Mm. Probably the easiest way is sometimes when your boss tells you, you should please come and have a meeting. All of a sudden, our emotional child starts to get really anxious. We start to become worried about, I wonder what this is going to be. Is it going to be a positive? Is it most likely to be a negative? And so we start to develop this kind of anxiety, maybe, for some people. And so when we experience ourselves as not being equal, but we perceive ourselves more less than a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we call it the emotional child. So where we don't experience ourselves as an emotional adult, but more as an inferior person. It can even be, probably you might even see that in some of the work that you do, Cynthia, when you try to correct a person's diction, for example, in their voice, where some people get really nervous or try to please you all the time and not want you to make any mistakes. These are all more behavioral patterns that come out of a wounding in our emotional self that is very useful to have that healed, because then we're much more free in our expression.
Yes.
So that's one aspect. So why is it different? So we were looking at it quite holistically. And then the other element, I think, where the process, because you can also say, well, let's just be considerate and be cognitive of our trigger points, and let's not be so self-critical or judging ourselves or monitoring ourselves. So we might as well think, well, we'll just stop it. But it's not that easy, right?
Yes.
So I certainly have noticed for myself that I used to do certain things where I know this is not the right thing, but I couldn't stop myself. Or this is where I knew this is what I should be doing, and I'm not. Certain practices, for example. So there are certain behaviors that I think we all run that run us rather than that we are in the driver's seat of it, that we have actually control over the patterns, or are able to zoom out of the pattern and move towards a new response somehow, as it is appropriate to an ever-changing surroundings. So, and this is where we then look into more our family of origin. So I can talk a little bit more about what we call the negative love syndrome, which ventures an explanation why certain behaviors are so so hard to shift.
Mhm.
Do you want me to do that a little bit, or do you have any
Yeah,
question there?
sure. So I think before we jump into that, there's something that I want to make a comment on, which is that you're saying people, this is so common that I see not only in my clients, but also people around me. They'll be saying, oh, I just tell myself that I'll stop that and I'll stop doing that. And just to realize that maybe a few minutes later, they're going back to do whatever they are not supposed to do. So instead, it leads you through a process where you don't need to tell yourself.
Right. Yeah. And so on one level, that's the lead up into maybe exploring a little bit this, what I mentioned, the negative love syndrome, right?
Yes.
So, and I go, in order to explain it, it's good to look a little bit into what we call, well, psychological development issues. Mm-hmm. So the way we see it, when a child is first born, we're born in this state of unconditional lovingness. We love our parents, right? Yes. So father could look like the hunchback of Notre Dame, and we still would think, wow, what a fantastic straight back this man has, so because at the beginning we haven't really developed a discerning intellect yet. But in our heart center, we're completely open to mom and dad. So we look at them through our heart center in that sense. So that's why we're saying we're born in the state of unconditional lovingness. Mm-hmm. And for us to recognize that that's who we are, we also need to have that reflected back to us by our environment. So that's why we sometimes, because we spent most of our more formative years with mom or dad, that's why we look there predominantly. This is not about blaming mother or father. It's more about understanding cause and effect, how our personality, our small self, was formed through some of environmental pressures. So what we basically need our caregivers to have a certain level of emotional intelligence and the ability to regulate their own emotional stress so they can be present to us when we were children. So when, for example, Cynthia, when you were sad, you needed your mom or your dad tune into you and say, oh, look, you look a little sad. Maybe you need a little cuddle. So you learn later on in life that it's okay for me to assert my sadness, my vulnerability, and I trust that my environment will respond to me in an appropriate manner. Or when you were afraid, you needed your mom, your dad tune into you and say, oh, you look a little startled. Maybe do you need any support? So we then also learn later on in life, it's okay for us to ask for help when we're faced with a situation that's too difficult for us to handle, right?
Yes.
And also as children, because we have all these mirror neurons in our brain, they need to be activated. So we need the presence of our parents simply recognizing, you prefer noodles over rice. Mm-hmm. So in that moment, the child actually recognizes, I'm being recognized. And in that sense, it gives us a sense of belonging. And also as children, we need to be seen in what we do, what our interests are, because we're all natural explorers. That's our creativity. So we also need to have our parents enforce that by sometimes saying, oh, well, you're really good at climbing trees. So we learn later on in life, wow, it's okay for me to follow my creativity, my interests, and I don't have to worry about whether the authority will approve of it or not.
Yes.
And I think another really important part is also that it is sometimes also really important for the child to be able or to feel safe enough to sometimes also say something to the caregivers when they engage in behaviors that are not fair or unjust, where sometimes we can say, look, Dad, I'm a bit angry because you didn't come to my school performance. Mm-hmm. And Dad needed to say, I'm very sorry, I was busy. But so we learn later on in life that it's okay for us to redress an issue, an interpersonal issue that may have come about. And we're able to do that without feeling that it might endanger the basis of our connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What happens when there's a breakdown in that flow, and because when we're little, our consciousness is very egocentrically organized. which basically means the world revolves around the child. If mom or dad are happy, it's because of the child. If there's some fighting going on, even with a sibling, it's because of when we are a child. So if there's a breakdown in the flow, and we call it the first shock point, that's where we then start to say the way I am is not enough. I have to be more than what I am. So if I'll be maybe like my mom or like my dad or behave in a manner that will make it safe in this family context, that's who I then will become. So we then move away from our essence, our pure consciousness, and develop the conditioned personality. And so that's what we then address in the processes. As I said, it's not about putting blame on the parent, but it's more about understanding what actually occurred, to understand more what our behaviors, what our personality structure, how it was built and how it was formed, and what we may need to work through, because we have to then actually work it through more on an emotional level, not only intellectually, because intellectually, if our intellects are so smart, how come we sometimes don't feel okay, right?
Yeah. So how would people realize that, oh, this is probably a pattern from my childhood, and this is something that I can work through it?
Well, that's sometimes not so. It really depends, I think, to some extent, a little bit of a luck for a person, whether they're exposed to those kind of concepts, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people, they sometimes think, oh, my environment has had no impact on my personality. Some people have that fierce independence. They don't want to really go there. And usually my experiences for people like that, they usually may have had too strong, that the parents were maybe a little bit too authoritarian, where they have a fierce independence. And sometimes that can be also a bit of a defense there. And there are consequences for that. So I think to understand whether it is a pattern, it's sometimes good to check in. Well, if I feel very critical, ask yourself, was your mom or dad very critical? See the way patterns work, we adopt these things. For example, I'm using criticality as an example. So if dad or mom were a bit critical or had high expectations in regards to our education, then we take that on and we either do it to ourselves. So we then become self-critical or have high expectation on ourselves. Or we do it to others. So we become critical and have high expectations of others. Or the third option is where we set others up to do it back to us. So where we unconsciously may invite people into our orbit that may be a bit critical, like maybe mom or dad were, or had high expectations. Or it could also be just a projection. Like, for example, when we are up on stage and you become tongue-tied or become self-conscious, that's usually where we project onto others that they look upon us with a critical eye. Or we go, the other option is where we go into a reaction formation against the pattern. So where we call it rebellion. So where I might say, I don't want to be like my mom or like my dad, so critical. I will repress all of that and I will never say a critical word to anybody. So, but that also then usually creates more inner turmoil because we have to put extra effort into trying to do the opposite. And for most people, if they had that, they usually do play out the full gamut depending on context.
Yeah, there are so many different ways that actually we are behaving out the pattern. Yeah, okay. So what are some of the improvement that people see when they went through the process?
Well, look, I think because the process is such an experiential piece, right now we can only talk really about the concepts a bit. But what makes the difference is that the process is grounded in mindfulness. So it's about coming back into just pure consciousness. And however, also taking responsibility for what our behaviors are. So it's actually moving out of the blame game in that sense. But in order to really move out of the blame game and shunning basically self-responsibility, we first of all also have to embrace the way certain emotions were repressed. So we work on an emotional level in the process. And so the first step or second step in what we call the cycle of transformation, first one is awareness, which we talked about it. The second one is what we call expressive work, where we get people to express their frustration at these patterns that block us, that block our own creativity, that block our own potential. And we help people to go beyond the way frustration and anger was allowed to be expressed in the context of their family. I'll give you an example. So for myself, when I was a little boy and I wanted to go to the swimming pool, my mom would always say, no, you can't go, because she was afraid I would catch a bug or something like that. So, and I tried to plead against it, tried to go against my mother's will, but she would always say no. And so I realized very soon that going into my frustration or expressing my anger or going into adversity, that wouldn't get me anywhere. So I learned early in my life to repress my anger and frustration and to go into thinking. So I became then very solution or focused, and I said, look, Mom, I'm just going to visit my friend Joe, who happened to live next door to the swimming pool. So I circumnavigated that. So and so that's also one of the aspects that then later on in life I saw when I had to have interpersonal discussions, maybe with girlfriends. I would always avoid any form of confrontation. I would repress my anger and would go into sort of finding a way around it with maybe some little white lies or something like that, which as an adult then has some real issues, particularly if you are in a leadership position. Does that answer your question a little?
Yes, and also it gives people an idea of how the process will help them. And what are some of the seeming, maybe some people will say, oh, isn't that good that trying to find a solution? But actually there are problems that, especially if you're in a leadership role.
That's correct. And look, what we say, it's not about that there are negative patterns. It's more the distinction between whether a pattern uses you or you using the pattern. So even being critical is sometimes really appropriate, right? So sometimes we need to give critical feedback, or we need to give ourselves critical feedback without going into, however, these deep toxic shame beliefs around ourselves.
Yeah. And sounds like that we're going from being reactive to mindful or responsive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think between a trigger and a response, there's a gap. And that gap is our human freedom. And so what the process does, it actually opens up, widens this gap, because we become more aware of our triggers, are more able to actually name them and recognize also the develop emotional language to describe it. To even for many years in my 20s, it took me a long time to actually recognize I was afraid, because I would always repress it. But actually recognize, I'm actually afraid right now, and being able to recognize it and say it even to myself, it starts to reduce then the anxiety.
Yes. Yeah. And I think from your sharing, there are two words that are coming out. I think it's choice, and the other one is freedom. So
that's exactly right. It's choice and freedom. That's probably the greatest gift. And I would say there's another element what's really important about the process, and that's probably the third step, which we haven't talked about, which is compassion and forgiveness. Because what the process very much focuses on is actually self-compassion, self-understanding, self-acceptance, self-forgiveness, and self-love. So it's not to become egocentric, however. So what we do in the process is guide people to be able to walk in the footsteps of our parents when they were little. So what the process does, and I haven't come across anything quite as eloquent as what this work does, is helping us to shift perspective and put ourselves into another person's shoes. So what participants in the process will do is they reflect on the socioeconomic, the historical context in which their parents grew up in when they were children, to understand actually the sadness, the grief, the suffering that they had to experience when they were children. And out of that understanding comes actually a new level of acceptance who they were, and a new level of forgiveness if that's needed, and compassion, and mainly gratefulness, because our parents gave us the gift of life, and that needs to be honored. And to really understand that, and once we developed actually that level of gratitude, and that moment we come from a place of abundance within ourselves. When we can live in gratitude, particularly at this time on the planet, I think all of humanity has to move more towards a mindset where we can be in gratitude about just being alive, rather than going into the blame game and feeling what this person has done to us or this nation has done to us, and where we have so many differences, and we try to move so many people move more into polarity. This is the good one, this is the bad one, and that is not the solution. If we continue like that as society, as a planetarian society, we will not make it really. So moving towards a gratitudinal, I don't know whether there's such a word, but having gratitude in our heart, it really helps us to see how existence gratuitously showers upon us, where we don't have to do anything for it, but where we just experience the blessing of being alive, and to also recognize what we have rather than and what is being given to us beyond what we feel what we have to do.
Yeah. And if every leader from every nation could have understood that, it would not have all these problems, all these chaos.
Yeah, and it's sometimes not so easy, but I think the process, what it does, it really enlivens our heart center. So where we come home, have an experience of what giving to give feels like. And so where we reclaim our creative force, who we actually are, and feel the freedom to express that. And that, however, can also only really done so we don't just become selfish. We actually recognize also that we are part of it all. And I think that's a very important spiritual experience for people to be initiated in.
Yes, yeah. And the heart center is really in need and in urgent need of development for everyone.
Yeah, and look, you also see there's obviously also personal benefits in that, because for some of the people that you work with, and they can express themselves and are, if they are more centered in the heart center, if they don't feel contracted here, then they give their performance, their whatever they do, whatever their presentation will become much more relevant to others. Because it's not so much what we say, it's usually more important how we say what we say, and that we imbue it really with our heart energy, because that gives meaning to what we're saying.
Yes, yes. And so this process is really an in-depth, a rich process with a lot of discoveries for people. And I know that there are some programs that you're hosting. And what's even better is now that everyone is online, and there are also online programs available for them. So can you introduce some of the programs?
Yeah, so we'll be doing some programs, and I actually have to check out the time. First of all, we do an online program which is called Let Love Flow. It's a one-day workshop, and it works for people who either have done the process or also who haven't done the process, but it's mainly for relationships. So, because what we found out, particularly during this time of lockdown, that a lot of couples struggle with being together, because all of a sudden you're in your flat 24/7. There's not you can't get away from one another. So the only way is to come together. And however, there are sometimes conflicts that we have. Mm-hmm. And so what the Let Love Flow is about is really creating a new vision for what the relationship is about, but also to help people, give people some conflict resolution structures so they can move through, so where we can then individuate within our relationship and heal the past, heal sometimes old infringements. So that's the one-day workshop. Yes. And then we're also doing another one, which we call Hoffman Essentials. It's a 2-day workshop where we go over some of we can't really replicate the depth of the experience during online. That's not possible, really. But we can give them more than a taste, and particularly also some tools and some practices that will help them to come more back to essence, and to identify also how to deal with certain patterns that are very, very limiting.
Yes. Yeah. So that will be the program that's best for people who are new to the Hoffman process.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll put all these links together with this video as well. Is there anything else that I haven't asked and you want to address?
That's an interesting question, you know. So yeah, maybe some of the considerations. So who is it good for and who is it not good for? You know, so the process. Well, Bob Hoffman, who was my mentor, obviously, he said the process is only good for a person who had a mother and a father. So, which I think he's right about, you know. So it's just one of those things. It's not, as I said, blaming the parents, but it's about really honoring the gift of life and also everything else that our parents were able to give to us. So on one level, it really is a modern version of ancestry worship, if you like it, you know, so which is, and really coming to an authentic form of filial piety, which can, however, really also requires us to really honor the gift of life and all the different elements that we've received, you know, from our parents. And so that's probably it's important to let you know, and your listeners to know.
Yes,
it's not appropriate for people who, for example, have addiction problems. You know, so if they use alcohol or anything else, that's not a place where you can go and have a detox. It's also not appropriate for people who have a psychiatric issue like schizophrenia or heavy forms of bipolar. That's not the place to do that. There are other methodologies that would be more appropriate. So, but it works particularly well for anybody who wants to be more in a leadership position, be it at work or be it in their own family. What I've noticed, my whole family basically has done the process, and it's fantastic when your children also have done it, because you have a common language. And it's particularly wonderful for people in, I've seen whole organizations who sponsor people to come and do the process work, particularly the management, because it really helps people to develop these soft skills, to develop the ability to listen first before we come up with an opinion.
Thank you for spending time with me and introducing the Hoffman process to my community.
That's so wonderful, and thank you. Yes.
Thank you.